Let me tell you something from one soul to another. There's a kind of wisdom that doesn't come from books. It comes from standing by someone's hospital bed, from waking up early, not because you have to, but because your body knows the sun better than most. It comes from loving people who didn't stay and forgiving yourself for things you didn't know back then. If you're reading this, maybe your knees ache a little more than they used to. Maybe the faces in old photo albums bring tears as easily as they bring laughter. And maybe you still wonder what tomorrow might hold. Even after all these years, let me tell you something. My friend, you are not past your prime. You are a walking library of stories, of lessons, of quiet victories. You've seen the world turn, not just on the news, but in your own living room. You've held hands that meant the world. You've let go when it was time, even when your heart wasn't ready. People say the best years are when you're young, but I think the most honest years come later. When you know who you are, when you can laugh at your own stubbornness, when a simple morning cup of coffee feels like a luxury, because now you actually have time to taste it. So here's to you, to your routines, your quiet mornings, your wise heart, to the way you still show up for yourself, for others, even when no one notices, to the strength it takes to keep loving, even when life has taken a lot. You are still becoming, and the story isn't over. The sound of the morning radio. A story for those who know the comfort of small routines. For over 30 years, Harold began his mornings the same way. He would rise slowly, careful with his knees, and shuffle into the kitchen with his slippers, whispering across the tile. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet only older homes know, full of sighs and creaks, like old friends stretching awake. He didn't need an alarm anymore. His body had its own rhythm, one that didn't obey the urgency of clocks. On the counter sat a little old radio scratched at the edges, the kind you couldn't buy in stores anymore. He turned the dial, and a familiar crackle greeted him before the smooth voice of a local host filled the kitchen. It was the same show he'd listened to since his late wife Marion first brought the radio home. "So we can dance while we cook," she said years ago, winking at him like she was still 22. Now the music was background to his every morning task, grinding the beans, pouring the water, the smell of coffee rising like a promise. He'd sit at the table with his favorite mug, a chipped one from a vacation in Maine, and listen. Sometimes the songs brought back memories he thought he'd forgotten. Sometimes they brought nothing but peace. But every morning, without fail, the sound of that radio made the house feel less empty. He didn't need much. He didn't chase excitement or noise. What he had was better consistency, memory and meaning tucked into the corners of every morning. And when neighbors asked if he ever got lonely, Harold would smile, pat his chest, and say, "Not really, I've got company, memories, music, and the comfort of knowing exactly how my day begins." Sometimes it's not the grand things that give us strength, but the quiet ones. A voice on the radio, the smell of morning coffee, the memory of love that lingers in familiar places, the bench by the lake. A story about time healing and the quiet return of connection. Martha hadn't visited the lake in over 2 years. It wasn't far, just a 15-minute drive from her house down familiar roads, framed by tall pines and wildflowers that nodded in the breeze. But after Jim passed, she couldn't bring herself to go back. It had been their place. A quiet spot with an old wooden bench that creaked under their laughter and secrets. But on a soft, breezy Tuesday morning, one of those mornings when the air feels like a gentle nudge from the past, Martha picked up her keys. She didn't plan it. She didn't dress fancy. Just a sweater, her walking shoes, and the thermos Jim had given her on their 40th anniversary. Still keeps it hot, she smiled to herself. When she got there, the lake looked just the same. Maybe a little smaller, maybe a little stiller, but still holding that same peaceful hush that made people speak in softer voices. She walked slowly down the path, passing young couples and joggers, none of whom noticed the weight she carried. And there it was, the bench, their bench. She sat down with a slow exhale. Her body had changed, but the way the wood held her felt the same. She poured a bit of coffee into the cap and sipped. The wind brushed against her cheek, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. An older man was walking nearby, tall with a silver beard and a kind smile that suggested he'd lost things too. He paused, gesturing gently. "Mind if I sit?" She nodded. "It's a good bench." He chuckled. "Best seat in town." They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable kind, the kind where nothing needs to be said right away. And after a few minutes, she asked, "Come here often?" He smiled. "I used to first time back in a while." She nodded, eyes still on the water. "Me too," and just like that, something shifted. Not everything. Not the grief, not the ache, but something lighter crept in. A possibility, a new chapter maybe, or just the comfort of knowing she could return. Sometimes healing doesn't come in big waves. Sometimes it comes in the decision to try to go back to a place that once held joy. And sometimes life surprises you with a new companion, even if it's just someone to sit quietly beside you watching the water ripple like time itself. The paint box in the closet, a story about forgotten passions and how they wait for us patiently. Eleanor hadn't painted in over 40 years. She used to back when the kids were young and life had moments of quiet between naps and school pickups. Back then, she'd sit by the kitchen window with a cup of tea and a small canvas dabbing sunlight into oranges and reds. Her brush was her way of thinking of breathing, of feeling things without having to speak them, but time as it does pulled her in different directions. The kids grew. Her husband worked long hours. Life filled with meals to make bills to pay, holidays to plan. One day, she packed her paints into a small wooden box and tucked it away in the back of the closet. "I'll come back to it when there's time," she told herself. She didn't, not for decades. Until one rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the house is too quiet and your hands feel restless. Eleanor opened that closet, reaching for a scarf, and saw the old paint box. She paused. Her fingers brushed the top. The hinges creaked as she opened it. Inside, the colors were still there. Some dried, some cracked, but the scent of old brushes and faint linseed oil brought her back in a rush. She could almost hear her young children laughing in the background, the radio humming a soft jazz tune. Without really meaning to, she cleared the dining table. She found a pad of paper in a drawer. Not canvas, but good enough. And she began slowly, carefully, like her hands were remembering a language they hadn't spoken in years. The strokes were wobbly at first. The colors didn't mix quite the way she remembered, but as the afternoon faded into early evening, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Joy. Not the big kind that makes you laugh out loud. The quiet kind. The kind that makes your shoulders drop, that fills your chest like a gentle breeze through an open window. When her daughter called later that evening, Eleanor mentioned it casually. "I painted a little today." There was a pause. "You did, Mom, that's wonderful." And it was, sometimes the things we leave behind don't leave us. They wait patiently until we're ready to return. And when we do, they greet us not with judgment, but with open arms, whispering, "Welcome back. We missed you." The shoelace lesson. A story about legacy, patience, and the quiet way wisdom is passed down. Every Saturday morning, George took his grandson Caleb to the park. At 7 years old, Caleb was full of questions, the kind that made adults pause before answering. Why is the sky blue? Where does time go? How do birds know where to fly? George didn't always have the answers, but he knew how to listen, which he figured was even more important. One morning, as they sat on a bench near the duck pond, Caleb let out a frustrated sigh. "My shoe keeps coming undone," he grumbled, tugging at the laces. "Want me to tie it?" George offered. Caleb shook his head. "I want to do it myself, but I keep messing up." George nodded. "I used to feel the same way. Took me weeks to learn, want to know the trick." Caleb looked up curious, so George leaned in, not just physically but emotionally. Carefully. Like this moment mattered. And it did. "You start with a loop," he said, his weathered hands mimicking the motion in the air. "Then wrap around, pull through, and here's the secret: don't rush. Shoelaces are like people. If you rush them, they get tangled." Caleb giggled. Trying again, tongue sticking out in concentration. The loop wobbled. The wrap slipped. George watched quietly. "Not bad. Want to try again." They stayed there for almost 20 minutes. Other parents might have stepped in, hurried things along, tied the shoe and moved on. But George had learned something in his years. The lesson isn't just in tying the shoe. It's in the time spent trying, in the patience, in the gentle encouragement, in letting someone fall forward into success rather than dragging them to it. Finally, with a wide grin, Caleb pulled the knot tight. "I did it." George smiled, eyes soft. "You sure did." They went on to feed the ducks and laugh about the noisy geese, but that shoelace moment stayed with George, because he knew even if Caleb forgot the knot one day, he'd remember how someone made him feel capable. That's the gift of age, not just the stories we hold, but how we pass them on. Not with lectures, but with time. Not with noise, but with presence. Sometimes the quietest lessons are the ones that echo the longest. A table for two, a story about rekindled love memory, and the courage to say yes again. There was a small Italian restaurant tucked between the bookstore and the pharmacy. Not fancy, not loud. Just warm, light, soft music and red checkered tablecloths that reminded you of a time when dinner was an occasion Margaret hadn't eaten there in years. She used to go with Paul every Friday night without fail. He'd always order lasagna and she the minestrone soup with a side of garlic bread. They'd sit by the window, talk about everything and nothing. When he passed, the idea of going back felt impossible, like walking into a dream you weren't ready to wake up from. But one Tuesday afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. A real letter, folded, handwritten, gentle. It was from Thomas Jenkins, a name from long ago. High school sweethearts before life took them in different directions. He'd lost his wife last year, and through a stroke of luck, and a persistent niece who believed in second chances, he'd found Margaret's address. He wrote simply, "I don't know if this is appropriate or even welcome, but I often think of our younger days. If you ever feel like sharing a meal, I'd be honored to see you again. No pressure, just a table for two, yours, if you'd like." Margaret sat with the letter for days. She read it each morning with her tea fingers tracing the handwriting as if it were a memory made tangible. Then one Friday evening, she put on her softest blue blouse, the one Paul always said brought out her eyes, and walked into that little Italian restaurant. Thomas was already there, hair grayer, eyes gentler, holding a small bouquet of daisies, just like he did before prom all those decades ago. He stood when he saw her. "You came." She smiled, heart fluttering in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I did." They talked for hours about the in-between years, about loss, about laughter, about how strange and beautiful it is to grow older and to still have the courage to begin again. When dessert came, she looked at him and said softly, "I never thought I'd sit here again with someone who remembers me before life got complicated." Thomas reached across the table. "I never forgot you." Sometimes love doesn't just visit once. Sometimes it circles back, wiser, softer, and still strong enough to make the heart leap, even in the quietest season of life. The Man with the Yellow Scarf. A story about kindness, dignity, and how one small act can open the world again. Doris had stopped going to the library, one she used to visit every week back when her knees were stronger, and her husband Henry was still around to carry the bag of books. She loved the smell of the pages, the quiet rustle of turning paper, the way the sun filtered through the high windows. But lately, everything felt heavy. The walk, the stairs. The loneliness. Until one brisk November morning, she bundled herself in her old gray coat and for no clear reason reached for a yellow scarf she hadn't worn in years. It was Henry's favorite. "Makes you look like a sunflower," he used to say. She took the bus, sat by the window, and watched the world blur past, all fast and unfamiliar. When she stepped off near the library, she hesitated at the steps. That's when she saw him. A tall, thin man with a kind face and mismatched gloves was standing near the door, humming softly as he handed out warm drinks from a small cart labeled, "Kind cups pay if you can take, if you need." She paused, unsure. He looked up, smiling at her yellow scarf. "That's a lovely color," he said. "Makes the morning feel warmer." She blinked, surprised by the compliment. "It's old," she replied. "Still shining," he said, gently handing her a cup of tea. Chamomile. Good for courage. Doris hadn't planned to talk, but something about his presence made her want to stay a moment longer. They chatted just a little about books, about tea, about how hard the wind had been lately. She stepped inside the library with the cup in hand, heart just a little lighter. Not because anything major had changed, but because someone saw her. Not as an old woman, not as someone fading, but simply as Doris in her yellow scarf worthy of warmth. She returned the next week, and the week after that. Always in the yellow scarf, always with a smile for the man with the tea. They never exchanged full stories, but they didn't need to, because sometimes all it takes is one soul reminding another, you still matter, you are still here, you are still part of the world. Kindness doesn't have to be grand. It can be a hot drink, a warm word, a single glance that says, I see you the first dance. A story about trying something new, even when everyone thinks you're too old to begin. At 76, Walter had never danced, not once, not at weddings, not in his living room. Not even when the radio played those sweet, crooning ballads back in the 60s. He'd always told himself it just wasn't for him. Too clumsy, too shy. And after his wife passed 5 years ago, the idea seemed even more distant. What was the point? But then came the flyer. It was taped to the bulletin board at the senior center, beginner's ballroom. No experience needed, no partner, required just curiosity. Thursday at 6:00 p.m. He stared at it longer than he meant to, walked past it twice. Then, on the third glance, he tore off a little tab with the contact number quickly, as if someone might stop him. He didn't tell anyone. On Thursday evening, he stood in front of the mirror, trying to decide if this was foolish. His hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt. It's just a class. He told himself, you can leave at any time. But when he arrived, the room was filled with warm chatter and soft music. No one seemed to notice he was new. No one asked him to prove anything. A kind woman named Ruth Spry, sharp-eyed, wearing sparkly sneakers, smiled and offered her hand. First time, she asked. Clearly, he said with a nervous laugh. She winked. You're doing great already. You showed up. They moved slowly. He stumbled. She guided. And by the end of the evening, they were laughing, full-bellied, genuine laughter that made his ribs ache in the best way. He went back the next week, and the next 3 months later, Walter danced in front of a small crowd at the center's spring social. He wore a blue tie and led Ruth through a foxtrot. People clapped. He bowed awkwardly, cheeks flushed with pride. Someone asked him after, "Why now?" And Walter simply said, because now was still possible. We are never too old for firsts. Not for dancing, not for joy, not for becoming the person we always suspected might still be inside us. Sometimes all it takes is saying yes and showing up the road to Willow Creek. A story about going somewhere alone and finding more than just a place. Claire hadn't driven more than a few miles outside her town in years. After her husband passed and the kids scattered across the country with families of their own, her world had gently folded into a smaller shape. Grocery runs, the occasional phone call, church on Sundays, and tending her roses. But tucked in a drawer by her bedside was an old photo, her and Peter standing in front of a sign that read, Willow Creek State Park. It had been their honeymoon, a cabin by the lake fireflies and long hikes they took hand in hand. She hadn't been back since. Life happened. Time moved forward, and the past became something you only visited in dreams. But one afternoon in early spring, Claire stood by the kitchen window, watching the robins return to the yard, and felt something stir. A whisper, a nudge. You can still go. So she did. She packed a small bag, filled the gas tank, printed directions, even though her granddaughter said GPS was easier. And early the next morning, before the sun had fully warmed the dew, she set out. The road wound gently through hills and pastures, old barns, wildflowers towns, with names she hadn't heard in decades. And Claire, 72 years old, traveling alone for the first time in her life, felt a quiet sense of bravery settle into her chest. When she reached Willow Creek, the cabin was still there, older now, like her, but standing proud. The lake shimmered just the way she remembered, and when the breeze rustled the trees, she could almost hear Peter's laugh. She walked the same trail they once did, sat on the same bench near the water's edge. And there, with her hands in her lap and the wind kissing her cheeks, she whispered, I made it back. Love, I made it. Claire stayed 2 nights, read a book, made tea, wrote in her journal for the first time in years. She didn't cry much, not this time. Instead, she smiled a lot. Sometimes the bravest journey is the one you take by yourself. Not to escape the past, but to honor it. To say, I am still here. To reclaim a piece of yourself you once thought belonged to someone else. Because even after great love, great loss, and great time, there are still roads open to you. The Garden Lesson, a story about legacy soil and the quiet way love grows across generations. Every summer, May's garden bloomed like a secret whispered back to life. She wasn't fancy about it. No expensive tools, no perfect rows, but her hands knew the earth like an old friend. Tomatoes the size of softballs, cucumbers, curling like commas, daisies, bobbing their heads in agreement with the breeze. It was a place of rhythm, of peace, of quiet purpose. Her grandson, Jamie, 12, and restless, didn't care much for flowers. He lived in a world of glowing screens and fast answers. But one July morning when his mom dropped him off for the weekend, May looked at him with a twinkle in her eye. "You and I," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "are going to plant something." Jamie groaned. "Can't we just go inside?" "It's hot," May chuckled. "The sun's supposed to kiss your skin, builds character. Now grab those gloves." He did reluctantly at first, but an hour later something shifted. Maybe it was the coolness of the soil beneath his fingers. Maybe it was the satisfaction of pulling out a stubborn weed. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the way May talked slow, steady, with stories tucked between instructions. "You don't force things in the garden," she said, patting the earth. "You give them space. Water, sunlight, and time. Same goes for people." Jamie looked up. "Even annoying people?" May smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Especially those." Over the next 2 days, they worked side by side, planting marigolds, picking ripe tomatoes, watching a pair of bluebirds argue over a worm. Jamie asked questions, May answered with stories, about how his grandpa once built her a trellis out of old broom handles, about how she cried the first year nothing grew, about how hope like a seed doesn't look like much until it does. When his mom came to pick him up, Jamie held a small pot in his lap. Inside, a tiny sprout peeked through the soil. "What's that?" she asked Legacy. May said softly, before Jamie could answer. "Wisdom isn't always passed down in speeches. Sometimes it's handed over in a trowel, tucked into a story, rooted in the act of doing something simple together, because the most lasting lessons don't bloom overnight. They grow slowly in the hearts of those we love."